Welcome to the debate. Imagine being on your deathbed. The room is quiet, the blinds are drawn, and you call your grandson over to the bed. You lean in, your voice is barely a whisper, to pass on this secret. A secret that your family has kept hidden, allegedly under the threat of torture and execution for over 500 years. You look at him and you whisper, "Somos judíos." We are Jews.
Wow. I mean, it is an incredibly powerful image.
It really is.
It's the kind of moment that completely shatters a person's understanding of who they are, you know?
It absolutely shatters it. And today we are investigating one of the most captivating, deeply emotional historical premises of the American Southwest. We are looking at the narrative of the crypto-Jews.
Right.
This is the premise that the descendants of Sephardic Jews, people who were violently forced to convert to Catholicism during the Spanish Inquisition, fled across the ocean to the remote frontiers of New Spain, specifically what is now New Mexico.
To the absolute edges of the known world at the time.
Exactly. And the theory proposes that out there, isolated in the high desert, they maintained a hidden, underground Jewish faith for 5 centuries.
And it is a premise that has completely captured the public imagination over the last 30 or 40 years. But we have to look past the romance of the story.
Which is difficult, I'll admit.
It is, but the central question we are examining today is this. Do the unique family traditions, the physical symbols found in rural graveyards, and the modern genetic data found in the Hispanic communities of New Mexico actually represent a resilient, continuous crypto-Jewish survival? Or, right, when subjected to rigorous academic critique, does this narrative reveal itself to be a modern origin myth? A myth constructed from, well, misinterpreted historical phenomena, religious shifts, and deeply flawed population genetics?
Well, I will be arguing that this is not a myth. I'm taking the position that when you look at the convergence of oral histories, vestigial religious practices, and modern genetic markers, they form a compelling, multidisciplinary web of evidence. The sheer specificity of the practices we see in the Southwest provides undeniable proof of a genuine, continuous crypto-Jewish legacy.
And I will be taking the perspective that this identity is, in sociological terms, an imagined community. I argue that the crypto-Jewish narrative is driven by the misinterpretation of much later Protestant missionary influences, an anachronistic reading of universal Catholic symbols, and, frankly, a fundamental misunderstanding of how statistical genetics actually work.
Okay, well, to start, we have to lay the historical foundation, because the context of the Sephardic diaspora makes the survival of a hidden Jewish identity in New Mexico not just a romantic possibility, but historically highly probable.
I agree the early history is vital context.
Right. We're talking about a multi-generational lineage of trauma here. If we go back to 1391, violent anti-Semitic riots swept across the Iberian Peninsula. Thousands of Jews were given a brutal choice: convert to Christianity or be murdered.
A terrible choice.
And those who converted became known as conversos.
Right, and in the eyes of the Catholic Church, a conversion, even under duress with a sword to your throat, was considered spiritually binding forever.
Exactly. But the authorities knew, or at least heavily suspected, that many of these forced converts were secretly maintaining their Jewish faith behind closed doors. So to root out these secret practitioners, these so-called Judaizers, the Spanish Inquisition was established in 1478.
Which leads to 1492.
Yes, which culminated in the Alhambra Decree of 1492. That ordered the expulsion of all practicing Jews from Spain. If you wanted to stay, you had to be Catholic. But the Inquisition didn't just stay in mainland Spain. It followed the conversos across the Atlantic to the New World.
Now, that timeline of the Iberian Peninsula and the early colonial period is historically undisputed. The establishment of the Inquisition in the Americas is a matter of strict historical record. It is the subsequent geographical leap that forms the crux of our disagreement here.
Well, let's look at that geographical leap. By 1571, King Philip II officially established an Inquisition tribunal in Mexico City, and it was absolutely ruthless.
Oh, incredibly brutal.
Right? If we look at the historical archives, Prominent converso families, like the Carvajal family in Nuevo Leon in the 1590s, were investigated, tortured, and ultimately burned at the stake in elaborate public spectacles called autos de fe.
Which were designed to inspire absolute terror.
Exactly. So put yourself in that position. If you are a secret Jew living in Mexico City or the surrounding colonial hubs in the late 16th century, and the Holy Office is actively burning people alive for refusing to eat pork, what is your natural human response?
Well, you run. You get as far away from the center of power as you possibly can.
You run to the absolute fringes of the empire. You go to the end of the known earth. And at that specific time in colonial history, the end of the earth was the isolated, brutal frontier of Nuevo Mexico, the upper Rio Grande Valley.
Look, I completely understand the logical appeal of that migration theory. As a thought experiment, it makes perfect sense.
Thank you.
You want a geographical buffer zone between your family and the Inquisition tribunal in Mexico City. But the leap from a 16th century geographical buffer zone to a continuous, uninterrupted 500-year underground religion requires empirical, verifiable evidence that I argue simply does not exist.
Oh, I have to push back hard on the idea that the evidence doesn't exist. Because we actually have the demographic data of the people who made that exact journey.
You're referring to Stanley Hoard's work.
Yes. Dr. Stanley Hoards, who served as the state historian of New Mexico, conducted incredibly deep archival research in Spain, Mexico, and the U.S. He traced the genealogies of the original colonial expeditions, and he found that 11 of the 19 original founding families of Santa Fe had documented Jewish descent.
Yes, Hoards did extensive genealogical work on those colonial rosters.
We are talking about specific families who had active Inquisition files opened against their relatives. They were literally fleeing the fire.
I don't dispute the colonial rosters.
And fast forward from those 16th century expeditions to the late 20th century, researchers go into the descendants of these exact same families in those exact same isolated valleys. And what do they find? They find people practicing highly specific vestigial Jewish traditions.
Supposedly Jewish traditions, yes.
We aren't just talking about a vague preference for certain foods. We are talking about grandmothers lighting candles specifically on Friday nights, sweeping dirt to the center of the room, adhering to incredibly complex dietary laws, and passing down those exact somos jodios deathbed confessions we opened with.
Right.
And when you anchor all of that lived experience with modern genetic findings, like the presence of the 185 del AG BRCA1 gene mutation, which traces directly back to the ancient Middle East, the narrative is undeniably cohesive. It's a straight line.
I see why you think that, and I know how persuasive that narrative is when all those disparate pieces are stitched together in a single storyline. But I come at this from a fundamentally different perspective.
How so?
The crypto-Jewish narrative we see today is, at its core, a classic lost tribes folklore trope. It is a psychological projection onto the specific, deeply biblical landscape of New Mexico.
A projection by whom exactly?
Initially, by Anglo-Americans and Protestant missionaries. When they moved into the Southwest in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they looked at this vast, arid, desert wilderness, and they habitually associated the indigenous and Hispanic populations they encountered with the lost tribes of Israel. It was an incredibly common romantic framing of the era. Dr. Judith Newlander, a folklorist and ethnographer who has rigorously deconstructed this phenomenon, points out that the so-called Jewish traditions, like observing a Saturday Sabbath or strict dietary restrictions, are actually the direct result of 19th and 20th century Hebraized Protestant missionary work.
Wait, hold on. Are you seriously suggesting that these deeply held family traditions, which perfectly mirror complex medieval Jewish laws, are completely fabricated?
Not fabricated. That is a crucial distinction. I am not saying anyone is lying. I am saying these traditions are fundamentally misinterpreted.
Misinterpreted?
Yes. Sects like the Seventh-day Adventists and the Church of God canvassed New Mexico heavily at the turn of the century. They introduced these practices. Furthermore, The physical symbols that proponents point to, like the six-pointed star on gravestones, are actually standard Catholic architectural motifs.
I mean, I definitely want to dig into the physical symbols later, but
And the genetic claims, which I know we will get into deeply, rely on a gross misinterpretation of statistics. It's a dangerous flirtation with 19th century race science, treating a breast cancer mutation as if it were an ethnic barcode for a religious identity.
that's quite a strong claim.
It is, but the evidence supports it. It's a complex case of mistaken identity, driven by immense social pressures, rather than an unbroken chain of medieval Sephardic Judaism.
Okay, if I'm listening to this right now, I'm probably thinking, how on earth could a community confuse a Protestant missionary from 1910 with a 500-year-old medieval Spanish lineage?
Fair question.
So let's step away from the bird's eye view of history for a second and zoom in. Let's begin with the most intimate layer of evidence, the lived experiences and the actual physical mechanics of the memories passed down behind closed doors.
Let's do it.
Because in the late 20th century, researchers didn't just find people saying they felt Jewish. They documented highly idiosyncratic family traditions that had survived for generations. We are talking about halachic practices, strict Jewish law.
I'm very familiar with the ethnographic accounts from the 1980s and 90s.
Then you have to acknowledge the extreme specificity of them. Let's look beyond just lighting candles. Let's look at the mechanics of butchery. Look at the oral history from a man named Keith Chaves.
Okay.
He learned of his heritage when his great-grandmother explicitly told him they were Sepharditos. But it wasn't just a label. She kept a very specific knife. It was rolled in leather, kept completely separate from all other household tools, and it was used for one thing only: killing animals with a single, continuous cut across the throat.
A specialized slaughtering technique, yes.
She absolutely abhorred the way her neighbors slaughtered livestock, which usually involved blunt force or shooting.
Right.
But it is more than just a technique. It is the precise, exacting methodology of shechta, Jewish applicable slaughter. The knife must be perfectly smooth, without a single nick, which is why it was protected in leather. The cut must sever the trachea and esophagus in one swift motion to ensure the animal does not suffer and that the blood drains completely, because consuming blood is strictly forbidden in Jewish law.
I understand the parallels you're drawing.
Furthermore, ethnographic accounts from families like Alicia Garcia's note that her grandmother would butcher animals and examine them inside out for impurities. She would check the lungs for adhesions, and most remarkably, they practiced the tedious, physically demanding process of removing the sciatic nerve from the hindquarters of the animal.
Ah, the practice of porging.
Yes, nicker or porging. And why the sciatic nerve? Because of the deeply theological, biblical story in Genesis, where Jacob wrestles with the angel and is struck on the hip socket. Jews are commanded not to eat the sciatic nerve in remembrance of that struggle.
Which is a very specific dietary restriction.
Exactly my point. You do not just independently invent the laws of shechita and the removal of the sciatic nerve in an adobe house in the mountains of New Mexico. You don't accidentally replicate complex Talmudic law because a Protestant missionary handed you a King James Bible.
Well,
how do you account for this extreme mechanical specificity if not through an unbroken chain of generational transmission?
it is an incredibly compelling argument when framed that way. I'll give you that. And I completely understand why, upon hearing about a grandmother meticulously avoiding the sciatic nerve, an ethnographer's jaw would drop.
Right.
But we have to look at the phenomenon of crypto-Protestantism. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that a specific butchering technique proves a continuous 500-year link to medieval Spain, especially when there is a much more recent, historically documented mechanism at play in those exact same valleys.
Okay, explain that mechanism to me. Because right now, I don't see how a 20th century Protestant teaches a rural Catholic how to properly extract a sciatic nerve according to Sephardic tradition.
Let's walk through it. At the turn of the 20th century, the American Southwest was opened up by the railroads. This brought a massive influx of Protestant missionary sects looking to convert the deeply entrenched Catholic Hispanic population. Specifically, we are talking about groups like the Iglesia de Dios Israelita, the Church of God Israelite, and various offshoots of the Seventh-day Adventists.
Right, they were active then.
These groups were incredibly active in canvassing marginalized communities.
Okay, but Protestants don't practice Shakita?
Mainstream Protestants don't. But these specific sects had a theology that was heavily Hebraized. They were intensely focused on the Old Testament. They were preparing for the imminent second coming of Christ, and their theological belief was that to prepare for the end times, they had to return to the literal laws of the Old Testament.
Literal interpretations?
Yes. They taught their converts that they must observe the Saturday Sabbath, not Sunday. They taught strict adherence to Levitical dietary laws, no pork, no shellfish. They taught that the blood must be fully drained from meat, and they commanded their followers to completely shun pagan Catholic holidays like Christmas and Easter, and to avoid veneration of the saints.
But these New Mexican families we are talking about identify as Catholic. They go to Mass, they don't identify as Seventh-day Adventists.
Outwardly, yes, they identify as Catholic today, but you have to understand the social dynamics of New Mexico in 1910 or 1920. Protestantism made some inroads, but the region was overwhelmingly, fiercely Catholic.
Very true.
If a family converted to an odd Protestant sect that worshipped on Saturdays and refused to celebrate Christmas, the social backlash was severe. They faced intense ostracization, they could lose their jobs, their social standing, and face literal excommunication from the heart of their community.
So they hid it.
Exactly. These newly minted Israelites realized the social cost was simply too high. So they ostensibly folded back into the Catholic majority. They went back to Mass to keep appearances. But beneath the surface, behind closed doors, they cherished the Hebraized faith they had accepted. They kept practicing their Saturday Sabbaths and their biblical dietary restrictions in secret. They became crypto-Protestants.
Wait, but what about the deathbed confessions? Somos judíos, we are Jews. Are you saying a Protestant elder just decided to start calling themselves a Jew?
In the context of these Hebraized Protestant sects, yes. It makes perfect theological sense.
Really?
Yes. These sects view themselves as the true spiritual Jews. They believe mainstream Christianity has been corrupted and that by following the Old Testament laws, they are the spiritual descendants of the Israelites.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
Right, so imagine a grandfather who secretly held on to this Protestant Israelite faith for his whole life, passing away in the 1970s. He whispers to his grandson, "We are Jews." He is making a profound theological statement about his hidden Protestant Israelist faith. But in the late 20th century, when the crypto-Jewish theory becomes highly publicized in the media, that grandson retroactively interprets the whisper as a genealogical statement of medieval Sephardic descent.
That seems like an incredibly complex sociological gymnastics routine.
Laughs.
No, seriously, you are asking me to believe that a Catholic became a Protestant, pretended to be a Catholic again, called himself a Jew for theological reasons, and then his descendants got confused by a media trend and accidentally assumed a 500-year-old identity? That requires ignoring the simpler explanation. They were actually secret Jews all along.
The simpler explanation isn't always the historically accurate one. And it's not just theological confusion. There is a massive socio-political engine driving this identity shift in the late 20th century. We have to introduce the concept of pigmentocracy.
Well, explain pigmentocracy for the listener, because I think it's a vital concept to understand your side of the argument.
Sure, pigmentocracy is a social hierarchy based entirely on skin color and perceived racial purity. For centuries in New Mexico, the dominant origin myth among the Hispanic elite was that they were the direct, pure-blooded descendants of the original Spanish conquistadors.
The fantasy heritage.
Exactly. They claimed pure European white ancestry, completely separate from the indigenous Native American and Mexican populations. This myth allowed them to maintain a sense of aristocratic prestige.
Right, but that myth was thoroughly debunked in the 1970s.
Precisely. In 1975, a brilliant Franciscan priest and historian named Fray Angelico Chavez published his exhaustive, multi-volume genealogical work, Origins of New Mexico Families. He utilized meticulous church records to prove definitively that virtually every single Hispanic family in New Mexico had extensive indigenous ancestry. The pure-blooded Spanish aristocrat lineage completely imploded.
The archives proved the myth wrong.
Yes, And look at the timing. Right around this exact same time in the 1970s and 80s, Anglo-Americans had cemented total political, economic, and cultural dominance in New Mexico. The Hispanic population, which had previously been the unquestioned majority, suddenly found themselves marginalized as a minority ethnic group on their own turf. Their old aristocratic origin myth was gone. They were facing a profound identity crisis.
And you are arguing that the crypto-Jewish identity filled that void.
Yes, claiming descent from white European Sephardic Jews offered a new, racially redefining escape valve. It was a social step up in a pigmentocracy. It replaced the debunked conquistador myth with a brand new lineage that magically bypassed indigenous ancestry and reconnected them directly back to white European history.
That's a heavy claim.
I want to be clear. I am not saying this was malicious or even conscious. It is a documented sociological phenomenon of how marginalized groups construct new identities under immense social pressure to regain status.
That is a fascinating sociological framework, I'll give you that. But I am not convinced by that line of reasoning because it completely ignores the materiality and the extreme specificity of the practices we discussed.
How so?
Think of it this way. If I am exploring the bottom of the ocean and I find a fully intact 16th century Spanish galleon, complete with astrolades, specific timber joinery from Andalusia, and 16th century cannons, it is highly improbable for you to argue that it was actually built by 19th century hobbyists who just happened to stumble upon 16th century tools.
Okay.
The evidence is too specific to the origin. You still haven't explained the sciatic nerve. You haven't explained the practice of covering all the mirrors in a house with black cloth when someone dies, which is the exact Jewish mourning practice of sitting Shiva. These are deeply rooted, highly specific Sephardic customs that are absolutely not taught by Seventh-day Adventists or the Iglesia de Dios Israelita. The Protestant theory covers the Sabbath and pork, sure, but it completely fails to explain the complex minutia of Talmudic law found in these valleys.
I would counter your galleon metaphor. What if it's not actually a 16th century galleon?
Well, then my analogy falls apart.
Right. What if it's a 19th century steamboat, but because you are so desperately searching for a galleon, every time you see a piece of curved wood, you declare it to be 16th century rigging?
Okay.
Ethnographer Raphael Patai documented exactly how these highly specific Jewish practices materialized. Dr. Newlander points out that well-meaning Ashkenazi Jewish researchers from outside the community often inadvertently planted these seeds during their interviews.
Planted the seeds. You mean led the witnesses?
Exactly. A researcher would go into a home and hear about a vague regional practice. For instance, an elderly woman mentions that she sweeps the dirt from the corners of the room into the center before sweeping it out the door.
Which is a known conversos practice.
Wait, listen to how it happens. The researcher, eager to find a connection, asks a leading question. Oh, you sweep to the center? Did you know that's exactly what crypto-Jews did in Spain to avoid desecrating the mezuzah on the doorpost?
Ah.
The subject, seeking connection and validation, internalizes that meaning. The next time an anthropologist visits, the woman says, I sweep to the center because that is our ancient Jewish custom. It's an ethnographic feedback loop.
But that assumes a level of passivity, gullibility, and almost total lack of agency on the part of these New Mexican families that I frankly find uncharitable. It assumes they don't know their own history until an outsider tells them what it means.
It's not about gullibility at all. It's about the very human nature of memory and identity construction. We all filter our family histories through the lens of what gives us meaning in the present.
Okay, even if we assume that human memory is infinitely pliable and that oral histories can be corrupted by researchers, we cannot say the same for physical objects. Let's move from the intangible memories passed down behind closed doors to the physical marks these families left on the world around them. Let's look at the material culture.
You're referring to the rural graveyards and the architecture?
Yes, because if the oral histories are contested as Protestant syncretism or researcher bias, we must look at what is literally carved in stone. For decades, researchers and photographers like Carrie Hertz dedicated their lives to documenting the physical artifacts hidden in plain sight across northern New Mexico. We are talking about gravestones in overtly Catholic cemeteries that are adorned with six-pointed stars, the Star of David.
And you view those stars as an unambiguous declaration of Jewish faith?
In the context they are found, Absolutely. It is a profound form of spiritual resistance and religious syncretism. These families had to be buried in Catholic consecrated ground. There was no other option for them. But they wanted to mark their true lineage. So you see gravestones where the Star of David is etched alongside crosses.
Right.
You see stones where the hexagram is cleverly hidden inside the geometric intersection of the cross itself. Sometimes it is placed discreetly above the heads of carved angels. These are permanent public markings of Judaism, traceable to specific known families, executed in a way that blends with the dominant Catholic imagery to avoid over-detection by the village priest.
But it wasn't just rural graveyards, was it? Proponents of the theory also point to major public buildings.
Exactly. Look at the Cathedral Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi, the absolute heart of Catholicism in Santa Fe. Right over the main entrance doors, carved in stone, is an inscription of the Tetragrammaton, the unutterable name of God in Hebrew. Inside the cathedral, on a prominent structural wall, there is a large hexagram.
Yes, those are very visible.
And furthermore, beyond the public architecture, we have the intensely personal hidden artifacts. I mentioned Elisa Garcia earlier, whose grandmother checked the meat for impurities. When her grandmother died, Elisa didn't just find memories. She found a physical, heavy silver menorah hidden away beneath the floorboards of her grandmother's room.
A menorah hidden under the floorboards?
Yes. Why would a devout Catholic family intentionally conceal a quintessential Jewish ritual object under the floorboards or lock it in a cedar chest, if not to preserve a secret faith? They knew exactly what it was, and they knew it was dangerous to display it.
I completely understand the emotional resonance of finding a hidden object. It feels like a cinematic revelation. But we have to separate emotion from evidence.
Okay.
We have to apply rigorous art history and architectural history to these symbols, rather than relying on pseudo-ethnography. Let's start by deconstructing the most prominent symbol you mentioned, the hexagram, the six-pointed star.
The universal symbol of Judaism.
Today? Yes. It is on the flag of Israel. But historically? In the 18th and 19th centuries? Absolutely not.
Really?
Relying on the foundational historical tracking by the preeminent Judaic scholar Gershom Scholem, we know that the six-pointed star was actually a standard Christian architectural motif for over 800 years before the Zionist movement officially adopted it as a widely recognized Jewish symbol in the late 19th century.
Wait, you are saying the Star of David is originally a Christian symbol?
I am saying it was a ubiquitous geometric motif in Gothic Christian architecture. If you travel to Spain today and look at the major medieval cathedrals in Burgos and Valladolid, which served as the direct architectural templates for the Spanish colonies, including the churches built in New Mexico, you see prominent hexagrams carved into the stone.
Huh.
You see them in the intricate rose windows. They represented the 6 days of creation or the Star of Bethlehem.
So you're arguing the stars on the graves in New Mexico are just generic, meaningless decorations?
I'm arguing that seeing a hexagram on a colonial Spanish Catholic grave in 1850 and assuming it means Jewish is a severe historical anachronism. It is taking 20th century geopolitical symbolism and projecting it backward onto 19th century stones.
I see.
These are Christian hexagrams carved by Catholic families who are copying the architectural motifs brought over by Spanish priests. And regarding the cathedral in Santa Fe, the Hebrew inscription over the door was explicitly placed there by Archbishop Jean-Baptiste Lamy in the late 19th century.
Lamy was the first bishop of Santa Fe?
Exactly. He was a French priest, and placing Hebrew on cathedrals was a common European Catholic practice at the time as a nod to the shared Abrahamic roots of Christianity. It wasn't a secret subversive code winking at crypto-Jews in the pews. It was standard Catholic theology.
That explains the cathedral, perhaps. Lamy was French. He brought European aesthetics. But what about the broader pattern? What about the fact that Hebrew keeps mysteriously appearing in the New Mexican landscape in ways that are not sanctioned by the church?
Let's talk about the broader landscape, because there is one piece of physical evidence that beautifully, perfectly illustrates my point about the Lost Tribe's psychological projection. Consider the famous Mystery Rock near Los Lunas, New Mexico.
You mean the Los Lunas Tacalig stone? The large boulder out in the desert with the inscription on it?
Yes,
For decades, local lore, amateur historians, and even regional television news reports claimed this was a massive, ancient Hebrew inscription of the Ten Commandments. People flocked to it. It was cited as absolute, monolithic proof of a hidden Jewish or ancient Israelite presence in the ancient Southwest. People wanted it to be true so badly.
Because it looks exactly like Paleo-Hebrew.
But it isn't. When the renowned Harvard epigrapher Joanne Hackett finally traveled out to analyze the stone, she completely dismantled it. She confirmed it as a complete linguistic concoction.
A forgery.
It's a meaningless, amateurish mashup of incomplete, upside-down letters pulled from various ancient alphabets, some Greek, some Paleo-Hebrew. It's a 20th century forgery, likely carved as a fanciful lark by a local college student. Yet thousands of people desperately wanted to read it as genuine Hebrew because they have been culturally conditioned to see the arid desert landscape of New Mexico as a biblical terrain. They look at a rock and see Mount Sinai.
That's an interesting point, and I acknowledge the Lost Luna stone is a forgery. But I would frame your argument differently. You are pointing out one known forgery to discredit an entire, authentic ecosystem of material culture.
I'm pointing out a pattern of projection.
You are looking at the forest and deliberately ignoring the uniquely shaped trees. Even if I concede that the hexagram has a deep, complex Catholic history in European Gothic architecture, that does not invalidate the context of its specific use in the remote villages of New Mexico.
Context is everything, I completely agree.
Then what about the conscious, intentional hiding of Jewish objects? A six-pointed star on a giant cathedral wall in Santa Fe is public. It's an architectural statement. A silver menorah wrapped in cloth hidden inside a grandmother's floorboard is not a generic Gothic architectural choice. Doesn't the context of concealment fundamentally change the meaning of the object?
Certainly makes it more compelling.
If these families were just practicing a quirky, localized form of Catholicism, or even if they were practicing your theory of Hebraized Protestantism, why the intense, visceral fear? Why the generational secrecy? Dr. Stanley Hordes noted that even in the 1980s, people would only speak to him in hushed whispers. They were terrified that their employers or their Catholic neighbors would find out they didn't eat pork or that they lit candles on Friday nights.
I don't doubt their fear was real.
That deep, paralyzing fear is not the legacy of being a Seventh-day Adventist. That fear is the epigenetic legacy of the Spanish Inquisition.
Or it's the very real legacy of being a Protestant sect in a fiercely, aggressively Catholic region in the early 20th century, which we know from court records and newspapers carried immense, life-altering social stigma. The secrecy doesn't automatically default to a fear of the Spanish Inquisition of the 1500s when there was a very real fear of social ostracization in 1920.
Okay, if the physical artifacts are contested as historical anachronisms and the oral histories are debated as Protestant syncretism or researcher manipulation, we must turn to the ultimate inescapable physical record.
Genetics.
Yes. We have to look at the DNA carried in the blood of the descendants themselves. You can argue about what a star means, but you cannot argue with a genetic sequence.
This is where the debate transitions from folklore and ethnography into biology. And frankly, this is where I think the claims of the crypto-Jewish narrative become the most scientifically perilous.
I strongly disagree. I think it's where the claims become mathematically undeniable. Let's look at the biological footprint. In the early 2000s, as commercial genetic testing became accessible to the public, descendants in New Mexico began looking for scientific validation of the oral histories they had been mocked for believing.
Enter Father William Sanchez.
Exactly. A prominent Catholic priest in Albuquerque. Growing up, he always sensed his family was different. They spun four-sided tops at Christmas, which strongly resembles the Jewish dreidel, and his family absolutely shunned pork. He wanted answers, so he took a Y chromosome DNA test.
Provided by Family Tree DNA, if I recall the timeline correctly.
Yes, and the results were analyzed by experts at the University of Arizona. And those results were staggering. Father Sanchez, a Catholic priest, discovered he carried the Cohenna marker. For the listener, the Cohenna marker is a very specific genetic signature on the Y chromosome that is strongly associated with the Jewish priestly class, those who traditionally claim direct patrilineal descent from Aaron, the brother of Moses. Dr. Michael Hammer, a leading expert on Jewish genetics, noted that fewer than 1% of non-Jews possess this specific marker.
A very rare marker.
Intrigued, Father Sanchez launched a massive DNA project, testing his relatives and his rural parishioners. Out of 78 people tested in his New Mexican parish, 30 of them were positive for the Kohina marker.
I have deep, fundamental methodological concerns with how those specific statistics were presented to the public, but continue. Build the rest of the genetic case first.
The case goes far beyond just the Y chromosome of one parish. Let's look at hard medical genetics. In the 1990s and 2000s, oncologists and researchers discovered an alarming cluster of a very specific mutation of the BRCA1 gene, specifically the 185del-AG mutation, in the Hispanic populations of northern New Mexico and southern Colorado.
Yes, it is a devastating reality for many families in the San Luis Valley. The medical tragedy of it is profound.
It is a tragedy, but historically, it is a profound puzzle piece. By comparing DNA samples globally, geneticists know exactly where this mutation comes from. The 185del-AG mutation originated in the Middle East over 2,000 years ago among the ancient Hebrew tribes.
Right.
Because Jewish populations throughout history have frequently married within their own religion, a practice called endogamy. This specific mutation gained a strong, concentrated foothold in that isolated population. Today, roughly 1 in 100 Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews carries this mutation.
Which is a high frequency, yes.
Finding this specific ancient Middle Eastern Jewish mutation heavily concentrated in Catholic Hispanic families in the remote mountains of the American Southwest is a biological smoking gun. It traces their bloodlines directly back to the converso arrivals of the 1500s.
I completely understand why to a layperson that sounds like an airtight case. But I come at this from a fundamentally different understanding of population genetics. Treating a breast cancer disease mutation as if it is an ethnic marker is not just scientifically flawed, it is a dangerous regression into pseudoscience.
Wait, explain that to me. If a disease is undeniably documented to have originated in the Middle East and is scientifically proven to be most frequent in Jewish populations, how is it pseudoscience to say its presence proves Jewish ancestry?
Because you're committing what geneticists call the minority disease fallacy. Let's break down the math slowly and clearly because it is vital. Yes, the 185del-AG mutation has a higher frequency or concentration within the global Jewish population. About 1% of Jews have it. But we have to look at absolute numbers, not just percentages.
Okay.
The global Jewish population is roughly 15 million people. The non-Jewish population of the world, and specifically the broad Spanish and Hispanic populations, is vastly, exponentially larger. We are talking about hundreds of millions of people.
Right. The base populations are completely different sizes.
Exactly. So even if the mutation is incredibly rare in non-Jews, let's say only 0.1% or 0.01% of non-Jews carry it, because the non-Jewish population is so massively huge, the sheer absolute number of non-Jews carrying this mutation will always outnumber the total number of Jews carrying it.
But its presence in this specific, isolated population in New Mexico.
Wait, let me finish the statistical thought because this is the crux of the fallacy. If a doctor finds a patient with this exact BRCA mutation in a hospital in the United States, the mathematical probability that the patient does not descend from Jews is actually greater than 90%.
Wow.
Greater than 90%.
Yes.
Just because a disease has a higher frequency in a minority group does not make it an exclusive genetic barcode for that religion. The mutation predates the formation of modern Judaism. It is a Mediterranean marker, not a Jewish one. Using a tragic breast cancer mutation to retroactively assign a medieval religious identity to a modern Catholic family is biologically unjustifiable.
But you were looking at the BRCA mutation in isolation. We aren't doing that. We're looking at it alongside the Y chromosome data, like the Kohanin marker in Father Sanchez's parish.
Even the Y chromosome data fails to support the crypto-Jewish thesis when it is subjected to rigorous, controlled, peer-reviewed academic studies, rather than commercial genealogy tests looking for a specific result. Let's look at the 2006 DNA study published by Sutton et al.
I'm familiar with it.
This was conducted by top-tier researchers from Stanford University and New York University.
They didn't just test a few parishioners, they compared the Y chromosomes of modern self-identified Hispanic males in New Mexico with a control group of modern males in mainland Spain. This is the ultimate control group experiment.
And the results. They found Middle Eastern DNA in the New Mexican population, correct?
Yes, they did. They found an identical 10% Middle Eastern admixture in both populations. Think about the logic of the crypto-Jewish theory. The theory argues that a uniquely massive, disproportionate wave of secret Jews fled Spain, went to Mexico City, and then concentrated themselves in New Mexico to escape the Inquisition, forming an isolated enclave.
Because they self-isolated and concentrated in those valleys, right?
Exactly. If that theory were historically true, the frequency of Middle Eastern genetic markers should be significantly higher in New Mexico than in mainland Spain today.
I see your point.
But the genetic data shows it isn't higher. It is statistically identical. What this definitively proves is that the founding fathers of New Mexico were just a standard, perfectly representative slice of the general Spanish population of the 16th and 17th centuries.
And the Spanish population naturally has Middle Eastern DNA.
Yes, it naturally contains about 10% Middle Eastern DNA due to 800 years of Moorish occupation, Phoenician trade, and general Mediterranean historical intermingling. Over 90% of the males in both the New Mexico and Spain populations showed no Middle Eastern ancestry at all. The Sutton study definitively proves there was no disproportionate influx of crypto-Jews to New Mexico.
I am not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are dismissing the massive convergence of evidence. Let's look at this statistically, but let's use a different analogy.
All right, let's hear it.
If I am an ornithologist and I find a specific rare species of bird in an isolated high-altitude valley in New Mexico, and I know that this bird is otherwise only found in dense concentrations in a specific region of the Middle East, it is not pseudoscience for me to deduce a historical migration pattern.
That is a clever framing, but a human being is not a bird. And a deeply complex system of religious belief is not a genetic trait you inherit like feather color.
But
what if that bird in New Mexico is actually a local species that just developed similar plumage due to environmental pressures? What if a 19th century trader brought a few over, and you're assuming they've been there since the Ice Age?
But humans carry their history in their blood and in their actions. You are asking the listener to look at this massive tapestry, the Kohanim marker in a Catholic priest, the devastating 18.5 DLG mutation clustered in these specific mountain valleys, the precise halakhic method of kosher slaughter remembered by grandmothers, the six-pointed stars hidden inside crosses on the graves, and the actual undeniable Inquisition logs from Mexico City detailing the persecution of conversos who fled north.
It's a lot of pieces, I admit.
You are asking us to look at all of that and dismiss it as a massive multi-century statistical coincidence? Frankly, dismissing all of that requires far more leaps of faith than simply accepting the historical narrative that they survived.
I am absolutely not asking you to dismiss it as a coincidence. That is a mischaracterization of the academic critique. I am asking you to recognize that culture is fluid, memory is fallible, and history is profoundly messy.
Of course it's messy.
Right, and I am not offering coincidences. I am providing historically documented empirical explanations for every single piece of your puzzle. The oral histories, they are explained by the documented presence of crypto-Protestantism and the sociological pressures of pigmentocracy.
If you accept that interpretation.
The physical symbols, they are explained by the 800-year history of Christian Gothic architecture and the retroactive projection of Zionist symbols. The genetics, they are explained by the minority disease fallacy and the natural demographic makeup of colonial Spain. When you strip away the romantic allure of the Lost Tribes narrative, the empirical evidence points to a modern community constructing an identity from the echoes of Protestant missions, colonial demographics, and an entirely human, completely understandable desire to find meaning and prestige in the past.
And I would counter that viewing every single piece of intimate family evidence as a misinterpretation, a statistical error, or a social construct does a massive disservice to the resilience of the human spirit.
I don't think it does.
It effectively erases the real, documented trauma of the Inquisition. It ignores the extraordinary, unimaginable lengths to which people will go to protect their faith, their traditions, and their families over centuries of persecution.
Recognizing the complexity of how modern identities are formed doesn't erase historical trauma at all. It just demands that we don't invent new histories to soothe modern anxieties.
Well, as we draw this debate to a close, we must synthesize where we stand. I maintain that the convergence of genealogy, vestigial tradition, and genetic markers forms a deeply compelling tapestry of survival. When a family in an isolated village in northern New Mexico lights candles on Friday night, abstains from pork, carries the specific genetic markers of the Middle East, and possesses oral histories tracing back to Spain, we are looking at survival against all odds. It is a testament to the enduring power and unyielding resilience of Sephardic identity.
And I maintain that treating folklore, anachronistic architectural symbols, and statistical genetic fallacies as empirical historical proof does a disservice to actual historical and ethnographic rigor. The crypto-Jewish narrative is a fascinating psychological and sociological phenomenon. It reveals so much about race, class, and identity in the 20th century Southwest. But when subjected to the light of academic scrutiny, it is fundamentally a modern origin myth.
Yet, despite our profound methodological divergence today, there is a distinct point of convergence here. We both agree that the history of the American Southwest is deeply, wonderfully complex. It is a landscape shaped by generational trauma, by multiple waves of complex migration, and by the intense, universal human desire to understand one's roots.
Absolutely. The need to seek identity in the past is a powerful, undeniable force. Whether these families are uncovering a 500-year-old secret kept against all odds, or whether they are constructing a new identity to navigate a rapidly changing social hierarchy, their search for meaning is incredibly poignant. The source material we have leaves rich avenues unexplored, particularly regarding the full extent of Protestant influence and the intense sociological pressures of the 20th century.
At the beginning of our discussion, I asked the listener to imagine a deathbed confession. The expectation is that history should be a clean, visible document with a royal seal. But the landscape of New Mexico, its hidden valleys, its silent graves, its complex, intertwined bloodlines, reminds us that history is often written in the dark. It is up to us and to you listening to weigh the evidence and decide whether those shadows are hiding a resilient truth or whether they are merely the shapes we project upon them.